In the days following the Kellers' visit, an uneasy quiet settled over St. Michael's mission. Father Gabriel went about his duties as always, conducting Mass, hearing confessions, and tending to his small garden. But those who knew him best noticed subtle changes. He spent more time in silent prayer before the old wooden cross, and his eyes constantly scanned the horizon during his daily walks through the settlement. Dr. James Morrison, who'd served as a field surgeon during the war, was among the first to recognize the signs. He'd seen that same contained alertness in veteran cavalry scouts, the way they could appear completely at ease while remaining ready for anything. The good doctor had arrived in the territory 3 years after Father Gabriel, and though they'd become friends, he'd always sensed there was more to the priest than his humble demeanor suggested. "You know," Morrison said one evening, sharing coffee with the priest in the mission's small kitchen, "I treated a lot of gunshot wounds during the war. Learned to tell the difference between a soldier's scars and a gunfighter's." Gabriel's hands stilled momentarily as he poured more coffee. "We all carry scars, my friend. Some are just more visible than others." "The Kellers are asking questions in town," Morrison continued. "About you, about the mission. They've been talking to old Santiago at the cantina, trying to learn your history." A ghost of a smile touched the priest's lips. "My history is with God now, maybe. But I saw how you moved when Jake grabbed you. That wasn't just instinct, that was training." Before Gabriel could respond, Maria burst into the kitchen, her face pale with worry. "Father, riders coming, at least 8 of them." The sun had nearly set, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. Through the mission's small window, they could see mounted figures approaching through the gathering dusk, their long shadows stretching across the sand like accusing fingers. "Doctor," Gabriel said quietly, "please take Maria and anyone else you find to the root cellar beneath the chapel. Lock the door. Do not open it, no matter what you hear. Gabriel, go, please." As they hurried away, Father Gabriel walked slowly to his sparse quarters. From beneath his narrow bed, he removed a wooden box that hadn't seen the light of day in 5 years. His hands didn't tremble as he opened it, revealing a pair of well-oiled Colt Navy revolvers nestled in red velvet. "Lord," he whispered, "forgive me for what I may have to do." Outside, Jake Keller's voice shattered the evening peace. "Come on out, Padre. Time to discuss that donation." Father Gabriel stood before his small mirror, studying his reflection. The years of peace had softened him somewhat, but beneath his cassock, the muscles remained hard from daily labor. His dark eyes, so gentle when offering blessings, now held a cold fire that would have shocked his congregation. With practiced movements that spoke of countless repetitions, he removed his priest's collar and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms crossed with old scars. Then slowly and deliberately, he began to pray, not in Latin, but in the lightning-fast Spanish of his youth, the prayers his mother had taught him long before he'd learned to kill. "Santa María, Madre de Dios, ruega por nosotros pecadores, ahora y en la hora de nuestra muerte." The rhythmic sound of hammer strikes on the mission's bell began to echo across the desert, the traditional calling of the faithful to evening prayers. But tonight, it sounded more like a funeral toll. Sheriff Thomas Wade was enjoying a quiet evening smoke on his office porch when young Miguel Sanchez came racing into Las Cruces on a lathered horse, shouting about riders at the mission. The boy's words tumbled out in a frantic mix of English and Spanish, but 2 things were clear. There were armed men at St. Michael's, and Father Gabriel was alone. "How many riders, son?" Wade asked, already buckling on his gun belt. 8, maybe 10, Miguel gasped. "The Kellers and their men. They had rifles, Sheriff." Wade cursed under his breath. Las Cruces to St. Michael's was a good hour's ride, even pushing hard. By the time he got there, in his 17 years wearing a badge, Thomas Wade had developed a keen instinct for trouble. Something about this situation felt wrong. The Kellers were mean, sure, but hitting a mission, that was asking for more heat than even they could handle, unless they knew something everyone else didn't. "Boy," he called to Miguel, "before you rode out, did you happen to see the old Santiago at the cantina talking to any strangers? Maybe showing them some old wanted posters?" Miguel's eyes widened. "See, Sheriff, yesterday he was showing some men a very old poster, yellowed like sun-bleached bone." Wade's blood ran cold. Santiago had been the territory's sheriff 20 years ago, back when Swift Hand Martinez was making his bloody name. If he'd recognized something in the quiet priest. At the mission, Father Gabriel stepped out into the gathering dark. The 8 riders had spread out in a loose semicircle before the church, their horses pawing nervously at the ground. Jake Keller sat at their center, a Winchester rifle resting across his saddle. "Evening, Padre," Jake called out, his voice thick with false cheer. "Or should I say, Senor Martinez?" Gabriel's face remained impassive, though something flickered in his eyes. "My name is Father Gabriel. This is a house of God. There's still time to ride away." Wade Keller laughed harshly. 20 years ago, they said you could draw and fire before a man could blink, that the great Swift Hand Martinez had sent 43 men to their graves. But you don't look so swift now, old man. 47, Gabriel corrected softly. "I've confessed each one by name." A tense silence fell over the mission yard. The evening wind stirred Gabriel's cassock, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out, a lonely, haunting sound. Young Billy Keller, watching the priest from the end of the line, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. There was something about the way the old man stood, something in how perfectly still he held himself, that made Billy's palms sweat on his reins. "Last chance," Gabriel said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet. "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." Jake Keller's rifle came up. "Enough! Boys, let's send this faker to meet his—" The mission bell tolled once, deep and resonant, cutting through Jake's words. And in that sound, something changed. Dr. Morrison, watching secretly from the chapel window, would later swear that he saw it happen, the moment when the gentle priest seemed to fade like morning mist, revealing steel beneath. What happened next would be told and retold in every saloon from Santa Fe to El Paso, each telling, making the legend grow larger. But Dr. Morrison's account, written in his personal journal that very night, perhaps comes closest to the truth. "It was like watching water turn to lightning," he wrote. "Gabriel's hands moved with a speed I still can't comprehend. The colts appeared as if conjured from thin air, their reports blending with the echo of that last bell toll. Before anyone could react, Jake Keller's rifle was spinning in the dust, and 2 of his men were clutching wounded gun hands. The remaining riders, stunned by the display, sat frozen in their saddles. Their guns were still holstered, and a lifetime of experience told them drawing now would only guarantee their deaths. They had come hunting a legend, only to discover the legend had been hunting them. "Your choice, senores," Gabriel said softly, the Colt steady in his hands. "Ride away now, or meet the God you made me forsake all those years ago." Billy Keller, young and frightened, was the first to wheel his horse. 2 more quickly followed, leaving only Jake, Wade, and their most hardened men. The desert wind carried the smell of gun smoke and fear. Wade Keller, his face twisted with rage, started to ease his hand toward his holster. "You can't kill us all, priest." 47 men thought the same, Gabriel replied, his voice carrying the weight of old sorrows. Each one died believing he would be different. "The only difference today is that I pray for your souls, even as I condemn them." In town, Sheriff Wade had gathered a posse of 4 men and was riding hard for the mission. The setting sun painted long shadows across the desert, and the lawman's mind raced with old stories. They said Swift Hand Martinez had once held off 15 bandits in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, using nothing but speed and strategy. that he could shoot a man's gun from his grip without drawing blood, that he'd only stopped killing when a priest had shown him mercy, taking him in despite knowing his bloody past. Back at the mission, the standoff continued. Jake Keller, his erstwhile confidence shattered, searched desperately for a way out. "Listen, Padre," he started, "we can—" A shot cracked through the evening air, but it hadn't come from Gabriel's guns. One of Keller's men, thinking he saw an opening, had drawn and fired. The bullet kicked up dust near Gabriel's feet. What followed, Dr. Morrison would write, defied everything I knew about human limitations. Gabriel seemed to flow like quicksilver, his body twisting as both Colts spoke as one. The shooter's gun flew from his grasp, a clean shot that left him stunned but alive. His second bullet caught another man's hat, sending it tumbling into the dust, a warning that left no room for misinterpretation. "Next time," Gabriel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I aim 2 inches lower." The remaining riders sat motionless, caught between fear and disbelief. The setting sun silhouetted the priest against the mission walls, his cassock moving gently in the wind, the Colts in his hands reflecting the day's dying light. In that moment of frozen tension, an old Apache saying seemed to echo across the years. The most dangerous warrior is not the one who kills without thought, but the one who kills despite knowing the weight of each death. Jake Keller, his face pale with barely contained rage, tried one last gambit. "You're still a murderer, Swift Hand. That collar don't change what you are, what you did." "No," Gabriel agreed softly, "it doesn't. But it changes what I choose to become." His eyes, hard as desert flint, never left the remaining riders. "I've spent 5 years seeking redemption. 5 years of service, prayer, and peace. God granted me a second chance. I'm offering you the same." Wade Keller's hand twitched near his holster. "Way I heard it, you quit because you got soft. Because some priest saved your worthless hide when you were bleeding out in the desert." A shadow crossed Gabriel's face, memory darkening his features. "Father Miguel found me 3 days after the massacre at Rattlesnake Creek. 7 men had ambushed me, thinking to claim the bounty. I killed them all, but their bullets found their mark. I crawled into his church, more dead than alive, expecting the last rites. Instead, he gave me a future." The words hung in the cooling air as the sun slipped lower. Dr. Morrison, still, watching from the chapel window, saw movement in the gathering shadows beyond the riders. Sheriff Wade's posse was approaching silently, using the dusk for cover. "He showed me that every soul can be saved," Gabriel continued, his voice carrying clearly in the evening quiet. "That violence breeds only violence. But make no mistake, senores, I haven't forgotten how to speak the language of blood." Jake. Keller's nerves finally broke. His hand dropped to his gun, but before he could clear leather, Gabriel's left Colt roared. Jake's revolver exploded from his holster, taking part of the gun belt with it. The right Colt spoke a heartbeat later, and Wade Keller's weapon joined his brother's in the dust. "Mary, Mother of God," Dr. Morrison would later write, "I've never seen anything like it. 2 shots fired so close together they sounded like a single report, each finding its target with surgical precision. It wasn't just skill, it was artistry written in gun smoke and lead." Sheriff Wade, now at the edge of the mission yard with his posse, held his men back. He'd heard stories of Swift Hand Martinez's legendary speed, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The priest moved like a striking rattler, every motion precise and lethal. "Your men have fled," Gabriel told the Keller brothers. "Your guns are gone. The sheriff is behind you with armed deputies. For the last time, ride away. Return to the path of peace, or I will send you to your final judgment." The desert wind carried the scent of sage and gun smoke as the moment stretched like drawn wire. In the deepening twilight, Gabriel's dark eyes seemed to hold all the weight of his violent past and all the hope of his peaceful present. The choice he offered was the same one Father Miguel had given him years ago: redemption or reckoning. Jake Keller's face twisted through a range of emotions: fear, rage, and finally a cold calculation that Gabriel recognized all too well. It was the look of a man about to make his final desperate play. "Now!" Jake suddenly shouted, diving from his horse. Three things happened almost simultaneously. Wade Keller pulled a hidden derringer from his boot, another rider threw a knife that glinted in the fading light, and Sheriff Wade's voice rang out from behind them, "Drop those weapons!" What followed would be debated in saloons across the territory. For years to come, Dr. Morrison would describe it as a dance of death performed at impossible speed. Gabriel's body seemed to flow like water between the threats, his Colts speaking with precision that bordered on supernatural. The derringer flew from Wade's hand, its trigger guard shattered. The thrown knife was plucked from the air by a bullet, spinning harmlessly into the dust. Two more shots disarmed the remaining riders before they could draw their backup weapons. "Santa Maria," one of the deputies whispered, crossing himself. "Sheriff." Wade and his men emerged fully from the shadows, rifles trained on the Keller brothers and their remaining men. "Show's over, Jake," Wade announced. "You and your boys are under arrest." But Jake Keller, hatred burning in his eyes, wasn't finished. "You think this changes anything, priest? You're still a killer. I've got friends in every territory. They'll come when they hear about this. They'll come in numbers you can't imagine." Gabriel holstered his Colts with fluid grace, the movement so practiced they seemed almost prayerful. "You're right about one thing, Senor Keller. I am still a killer." He reached up and touched the cross hanging from his neck. "That's precisely why I chose this path. Every day, I pray for the souls of the men I've sent to their graves, including the souls of those who have yet to make the choice you're making now." Sheriff Wade's deputies moved in, binding the Kellers and their men with practiced efficiency. The evening wind carried the first cool hints of desert night, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote called out, a lonesome sound that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. Dr. Morrison emerged from the chapel with Maria and the others who had taken shelter in the root cellar. They found Gabriel kneeling in the dust, carefully retrieving his fallen priest's collar. "Father," Maria asked softly, "will they really come? More men seeking violence?" Gabriel stood slowly, brushing dust from his cassock. His eyes scanned the horizon, where the last light was fading from the sky. "Yes, my child. Men like the Kellers live in a world where reputation is everything. Word of this will spread." Sheriff Wade, having secured his prisoners, approached the priest. "You could come back to town with us. Be safer than staying out here alone." A small smile touched Gabriel's lips as he replaced his collar. "I am never alone, Sheriff. This is where I'm needed, where both of my callings can serve God's purpose." As the sheriff's posse rode away with their prisoners, Gabriel stood before his small church, silhouetted against the darkening sky. The mission bell tolled once more, calling the faithful to evening prayers, its deep voice rolling across the desert like distant thunder. The night ahead would be long, filled with prayer and contemplation. But Gabriel's swift hand Martinez, the priest of St. Michael's mission, knew that somewhere in the territories, other violent men were about to learn of today's events. The peace he'd found these past 5 years had come at a price. Now it would have to be defended, one soul at a time. Word travels fast in the territories, carried on horseback and whispered in the shadows of saloons. Within 3 days of the Keller brothers' arrest, the story had reached every corner of New Mexico. Each telling grew more elaborate, transforming the quiet priest of St. Michael's into something between a saint and a gunslinger. In a dimly lit cantina in Santa Fe, a weathered man named Francisco Vargas listened to these tales with particular interest. 20 years ago, he'd ridden with Swift Hand Martinez, back when they were both much younger and death rode beside them like a constant companion. They say he shot the guns right out of their hands, Francisco, the cantina keeper said, polishing a glass. Without drawing blood, like the old days. Vargas sipped his tequila, his scarred face thoughtful. Gabriel always said the hardest thing wasn't hitting what you aimed at, it was choosing where to aim. In Las Cruces, Sheriff Wade was dealing with the aftermath. The Keller brothers sat in his jail, but their threats weren't idle. 3 known gunmen had already arrived in town, asking questions about St. Michael's mission. More would follow. You could send him warning, Deputy Wilson suggested, watching another stranger ride in through the dusty street. Wade shook his head. Man like that doesn't need warning. He's known what's coming since the moment he drew those Colts. At the mission, life had returned to its quiet routine, though subtle changes were evident. The children's reading lessons now took place inside the chapel rather than in the garden. Dr. Morrison found excuses to visit more frequently, his medical bag always containing extra ammunition alongside his surgical tools. Gabriel himself seemed unchanged, save for the fact that his Colts now stayed within arm's reach, even during a mass. If the weight of impending violence bothered him, it didn't show in his sermons or his gentle dealings with his flock. One evening, as he tended the mission's small garden, Maria brought him a worrying report. Riders watched the mission all day from the hills, she said. 4 of them. They left when the sun began to set. Gabriel nodded, carefully pruning a tomato plant. They're testing our routine, looking for patterns, the real ones, the dangerous. Ones will come soon. How can you be so calm, Father? He straightened, brushed soil from his hands. Because I've lived both lives, my child, the life of violence and the life of peace. I know which one holds true power. He touched the cross at his neck. In my previous life, I fought for reputation, for pride, for what I thought was justice. Now I fight for something greater. But even as he spoke these words of faith, his eyes scanned the distant hills where the mysterious riders had been watching. He recognized the tactics. He'd used them himself in the old days. The observers would be replaced by killers, men drawn by the challenge of facing the legendary swift-hand Martinez. That night, after evening prayers, Gabriel sat alone in the chapel, cleaning his Colts by candlelight. The familiar ritual was both meditation and preparation. As his hands moved over the weapons with practiced care, he whispered prayers in Spanish and Latin, asking forgiveness for what he'd done and for what he knew he would have to do again. The candle's flame cast his shadow on the adobe wall, and for a moment it seemed to waver between the shape of a priest and that of a gunfighter. Outside, the desert wind carried secrets across the darkness, whispering of violence to come. Francisco Vargas arrived in Las Cruces on a dust-covered horse, his presence drawing immediate attention. The old gunfighter's reputation preceded him. They said he'd ridden with swift-hand Martinez during the bloodiest years, back when their names were whispered like curses in the border towns. Sheriff Wade found him at the saloon, nursing a bottle of tequila. "You're a long way from Santa Fe, Vargas." "Came to see an old friend," Francisco replied, his voice rough as desert gravel. "Before others find him—" "Others?" Vargas's scarred face darkened. "The Keller brothers have friends in low places. They've sent word to the De La Cruz brothers in Chihuahua. 3 of the meanest killers south of the border." The sheriff's hand unconsciously moved to his gun. The De La Cruz brothers were infamous, ruthless professionals who killed for pleasure as much as profit. "How long?" 2 days, maybe 3. Vargas stood, leaving coins on the bar. Time enough to warn him, though Gabriel never did heed warnings well. At St. Michael's, the mission's routine had taken on an edge of watchfulness. Dr. Morrison had organized the men of the community into informal patrols. Maria's young son, Miguel, quick and quiet, served as messenger between the mission and town. Gabriel spent more time in prayer than ever, but his devotions now had a dual purpose. From the chapel's bell tower, he could see for miles across the desert, Every morning and evening, as he spoke his offices, his eyes scanned the horizon for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. "You expect trouble soon, Father?" Doctor Morrison asked, finding Gabriel in this vigil one evening. "I expect men who have forgotten God," the priest replied softly. "Men like I once was, who understand only the language of violence." He touched the cross at his neck. "But perhaps some can still be taught another way." The doctor studied his friend's profile in the fading light. "And if they can't be taught?" Gabriel's eyes remained on the distant horizon. "Then I will speak to them in the old tongue. One last time." That night, Francisco Vargas arrived at the mission, leading his tired horse through the gathering darkness. Gabriel met him at the gate, and for a long moment the two old friends simply regarded each other in silence. "You've grown soft, Gabriel," Francisco said finally, but there was no malice in his voice. "The cassock suits you." "And you've grown old, mi hermano," Gabriel replied with a small smile. "Yet here you are, still chasing ghosts." They shared wine in Gabriel's sparse quarters, speaking of old times and ancient wounds. Francisco told him about the De la Cruz brothers, their reputation, their methods. Gabriel listened in silence, his fingers absently tracing the cross at his neck. 3 against 1, Francisco said finally. "Even for swift-hand Martinez, those are long odds." Gabriel's eyes met his old friend's. "Will you stand with me then? One last time?" Francisco's scarred face broke into a fierce grin. "For that, mi hermano, I cross 2 territories. The De la Cruz brothers think they hunt a lone priest. Let them learn what it means to face the ghosts of the past." Dawn painted the desert in shades of blood and gold as Gabriel and Francisco knelt in the chapel for morning prayers. Their guns lay before the altar, Gabriel's twin Colts and Francisco's well-worn Remington, an odd offering before the cross. "Never. I thought I'd see you pray again," Gabriel said softly, finishing his rosary. Francisco touched the crucifix hanging beside his gun belt. "I learned from you, hermano. Sometimes the sword needs the spirit to guide it." Dr. Morrison found them, later in the mission garden, teaching the local men how to shoot with precision rather than panic. The sight of the quiet priest demonstrating the lightning-fast cross-draw that had made him legendary stirred something in the doctor's memory. "I was at Fort Stanton," Morrison said suddenly, 10 years ago, when they brought in those 3 cavalrymen you'd shot. Clean wounds, all of them, through the shoulder, exact same spot. They lived." Gabriel nodded, adjusting a young farmer's grip on his revolver. "Taking life should never be the first choice, Doctor. Even in my darkest days, I tried to remember. That, the day passed in preparation. Francisco, drawing on years of experience, helped position lookouts and establish signals. Gabriel spent time with each family, offering blessings and quiet words of comfort. The tension in the air grew thick as storm clouds gathering on the horizon. In Las Cruces, Sheriff Wade received troubling news. His deputy had spotted the D2 La Cruz brothers' advance scouts, 2 Mexican gunmen known for their ruthlessness, watching the town from the hills. "They're not just coming for the priest," Wade realized. "They mean to make an example of the whole mission." He sent Miguel racing toward St. Michael's with the warning, but the boy returned with a surprising message. "Father Gabriel says to let them come. He says some sins must be faced in the light." As evening approached, Francisco stood in the bell tower, his weathered face turned toward the south. "They'll come at dawn," he said when Gabriel joined him. "The youngest brother, Ramon, he likes to attack with the rising sun behind him. Thinks it makes him harder to shoot." Gabriel smiled faintly. "Some things never change. The young always. And think they've invented new ways of killing." A comfortable silence fell between the old friends. Finally, Francisco spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Remember that morning in Sonora, when we faced the Alvarez gang? God forgive me, but I remember every morning like that. We were different men then. Gabriel touched his priest's collar. Were we? Or were we always searching for something more than death and glory, mi hermano? Below them, the mission grounds had taken on the appearance of a fortress. Men moved with quiet purpose, checking weapons and positions. Women prepared bandages and boiled water, their prayers mixing with the evening wind. Maria found Gabriel later, tending to his colts with the same care he showed the sacred vessels of the church. "Father," she said softly, "some of the children are afraid." He looked up, his dark eyes gentle. "Then we shall pray with them, my child, and remind them that God's love is stronger than any man's hatred." But as he followed her to comfort the frightened little ones, his right hand brushed unconsciously against his gun belt. Tomorrow would test both his aims, to protect his flock and to save souls, even those of men who didn't want saving. Night fell over St. Michael's Mission like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an unnatural stillness. Even the coyotes seemed to sense the approaching storm, their usual evening songs replaced by wary silence. In the chapel, Gabriel heard final confessions, his gentle voice offering comfort and absolution to those who might face death with the dawn. Sheriff Wade, against all protocol, had ridden out alone to the mission. He found Francisco Vargas walking the perimeter, a Winchester cradled in his arms. "Got word," Wade said quietly. "The De La Cruz brothers crossed the border yesterday. 15 riders with them, professional killers, all of them." Francisco's scarred face remained impassive. "Numbers don't matter. Gabriel and I, we once faced 30 federales in a box canyon outside Nogales. The only difference is now he prays for the men he shoots." Inside his quarters, Gabriel knelt before a small altar, the candlelight casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls. His priest's cassock was carefully folded beside his bed, replaced by the black shirt and vest he'd worn in his former life. The colts lay before him, their well-oiled surfaces reflecting the flame's glow. Dr. Morrison, bringing fresh bandages, paused in the doorway. "Does it ever get easier?" he asked. "Waiting for violence?" "No," Gabriel replied without turning, "but the waiting teaches us something about ourselves, about what we're willing to die for." He crossed himself. "Or kill for." The doctor hesitated. "The men are asking, will you wear your cassock tomorrow?" Now Gabriel did turn, and Morrison saw both the priest and the gunfighter in his eyes. "The cloth doesn't make the man, doctor, but yes, these men have come to kill a priest. Let them face one." Around midnight, Maria's son Miguel came racing back from his scouting position on the south road. "Riders!" he gasped, "coming up through the old creek bed." Francisco's rifle came up, but Gabriel placed a gentle hand on his friend's arm. "No, those are just scouts testing our awareness. The real attack comes at dawn." His voice carried the certainty of deadly experience. "The De La Cruz brothers are artists of death. They'll want to make a performance of it." Sheriff Wade argued for evacuating the women and children, but Gabriel shook his head. "The mission is their home, and if we fail, nowhere in the territory will be safe from men like the De La Cruz brothers. Sometimes we must defend more than just lives." As the night deepened, Gabriel moved among his people, offering quiet words of encouragement. To the armed men, he gave tactical advice wrapped in prayers. To the women preparing medical supplies, he spoke of faith and courage. To the children huddled in the root cellar, he told stories of saints and martyrs who had faced darkness without fear. Francisco watched his old friend with wondering eyes. "You've changed, Gabriel," he said when they met in the chapel doorway, "but somehow you're still the same man I rode with." "God doesn't change who we are, mi hermano," Gabriel replied softly. "He simply shows us who we were meant to be." The first hint of false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Soon the sun would rise over the desert, bringing with it men who dealt in death and pain. but they would find more than just a mission in their path. They would find faith armed with steel, mercy backed by gunpowder, and two ghosts from the past who had learned that some things were worth killing for and dying for. The De La Cruz brothers arrived with the sunrise, just as Gabriel had predicted. They came in a thundering wave of hoofbeats and violence. 18 riders strong, their horses' shadows stretching long across the mission yard. Ramon, the youngest brother, led the charge with the rising sun at his back, just as Francisco had foretold. But Gabriel's swift-hand Martinez had spent 5 years watching the sun rise over these same walls. He knew every shadow, every angle of light. Before the first shot was fired, he was already moving, his cassock flowing around him like a shadow-given form. "In nomine patris," he whispered, the Colts appearing in his hands as if conjured by the prayer itself. The first volley of gunfire shattered the morning peace, bullets chipping adobe and splintering wood. But the mission's defenders were ready. Dr. Morrison, watching from his makeshift aid station in the chapel, would later write, "It was like witnessing a dance choreographed by angels and demons together." Gabriel seemed to flow between the bullets, his Colt speaking with devastating precision. 2 riders fell from their saddles, wounded but alive, the priest's mercy evident even in the midst of violence. Francisco's Winchester cracked from the bell tower, forcing the attackers to scatter. "The priest is mine!" Ramon de la Cruz shouted in Spanish, wheeling his horse for another charge. At 25, he had already killed 30 men, each death building his reputation as the deadliest young gun in northern Mexico. "Your reputation means nothing here, Hijo," Gabriel called back, his voice carrying clearly over the gunfire. "This is holy ground." Marco de la Cruz, the eldest brother, tried to direct his men to surround the mission, but Gabriel had prepared too well. Local men, positioned carefully on the roof and behind reinforced windows, laid down a steady fire that kept the attackers at bay. Sheriff Wade and his deputies arriving from town added their rifles to the defense. "It's a trap, Marco," the middle brother, Luis, shouted. "The priest planned it all." Indeed, every attempt to flank the mission was met with precise resistance. Every charge was turned back. Gabriel moved like a ghost through his carefully prepared kill zones, never wasting a shot, every bullet finding its mark with surgical precision. But the De La Cruz brothers hadn't earned their bloody reputation by giving up easily. Marco, his face twisted with rage, pulled something from his saddlebag, a stick of dynamite, its fuse already lit. "Send your priest to heaven," he roared, drawing back his arm to throw. What happened next would be retold in border cantinas for decades. Gabriel's left Colt roared once, the bullet striking the dynamite in midair. The explosion knocked horses and riders sprawling, filling the air with dust and confusion. Through the chaos, Gabriel's voice carried like thunder. "I give you one last chance. Surrender, seek absolution, and live." Francisco, reloading his Winchester, called down from the bell tower, "They never did listen to reason, hermano." Ramon de la Cruz, youngest and proudest of the brothers, screamed in fury and charged straight at Gabriel, guns blazing in both hands. The sun behind him cast his shadow before him like a demon's silhouette stretching across the mission yard. Gabriel stood his ground, cassock moving in the gun-smoke-laden wind, the cross at his neck catching the morning light. In that moment, those watching would later swear he seemed to embody both his callings, the mercy of the priest and the deadly skill of the gunslinger, wrapped together in a single purpose. Time seemed to slow as Ramon de la Cruz bore down on Gabriel, each hoofbeat echoing like thunder in the mission yard. The young gunman's shots came fast and precise, a double-handed technique that had killed many men. But Gabriel moved like smoke in morning light, each bullet finding only empty air where he had stood a heartbeat before. "I see myself in you, Hijo," Gabriel called out, his voice carrying an almost fatherly concern. So much anger, so much pride. Die, priest! Ramon screamed, firing again and again. Gabriel's response was written in gun smoke and lead. His right Colt spoke twice, so rapidly the reports blended into one. Ramon's guns flew from his hands, young killer's deadly accuracy undone by shots so precise they seemed almost miraculous. But Marco and Luis de la Cruz had used their brother's charge as cover. They led their remaining men in a desperate assault on the mission's main entrance. Francisco's Winchester dropped 2 attackers, but the others reached the heavy wooden doors. Gabriel. Francisco shouted in warning. Inside the chapel, Dr. Morrison was moving the wounded deeper into the building when he heard the doors splinter. He turned to see Marco de la Cruz burst in, pistol raised, but before the killer could fire, Gabriel seemed to materialize from the gun smoke like an avenging angel. "Not in my church," the priest said softly. What followed, Morrison would later write, defied everything I thought possible with a firearm. Gabriel's Colts moved in a complex pattern, each shot precisely placed. Marco's gun hand was hit first. Then his brother Luis's shoulder as he came through the door. 3 more shots disarmed their remaining men with surgical accuracy. "Santa Maria!" Luis gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. The stories were true. Ramon, having retrieved one of his fallen guns with his left hand, tried one final desperate shot from outside. The bullet struck the cross hanging from Gabriel's neck, sending it spinning through the air. But even as the symbol of his faith fell, Gabriel's aim remained true. His last bullet caught Ramon's gun, splitting it in 2. "Enough!" Gabriel's voice filled the chapel, carrying the weight of both command and compassion. "Look around you. Look at what your pride has brought." The morning sun streamed through the chapel windows, illuminating the scene in harsh relief. The de la Cruz brothers' fearsome reputation lay in tatters among the wounded and disarmed men groaning on the floor. Not one was dead. Each shot had been carefully placed to wound rather than kill. "You could have killed us all," Marco said, his voice holding a note of wonder. "Swift-hand Martinez never showed mercy before." "I am not only swift-hand anymore," Gabriel replied, retrieving his fallen cross. "And killing is easy. Mercy, that is what takes true courage." Francisco came down from the bell tower, his Winchester still ready. Sheriff Wade and his deputies moved in to take custody of the wounded attackers. But Gabriel wasn't finished. He knelt beside Ramon, who lay weeping in pain and shame. "Your way leads only to more death, Hijo," he said softly. "I know. I walked it for many years, but there is another path." The young killer looked up into eyes that held both steel and compassion. "What other path?" Gabriel helped him sit up, then pressed his own cross into Ramon's trembling hand. "The path of redemption, the same one I found in this very chapel 5 years ago. The choice is yours." In the days that followed the battle at St. Michael's Mission, stories spread across the territory like wildfire. They spoke of a priest who moved like lightning, of mercy delivered at gunpoint, of redemption offered in the midst of violence. But the true miracle, as Dr. Morrison would later write in his journal, came in the aftermath. The De La Cruz brothers, notorious killers who had terrorized the borderlands for years, laid down their guns in surrender. Sheriff Wade's jail had never held such dangerous men, yet they remained oddly peaceful, spending hours in conversation with the priest who had defeated them. "I've never seen anything like it," Wade told Francisco one evening at the saloon. Marco de la Cruz, who once burned down a village just to kill one man, now spends his days reading a Bible. Francisco smiled, sipping his tequila. Gabriel always said the hardest battles are fought in the soul, not with guns. At the mission, life slowly returned to normal, though changes were evident. The local men stood straighter, carried themselves with quiet confidence. They had faced the territory's most feared killers and survived. More than that, they had protected their home, their families, their faith. Gabriel himself seemed unchanged, save for a new depth in his sermons. He spoke of redemption, not as an abstract concept, but as a living truth he had witnessed firsthand. The cross he had given Ramon now hung in the chapel, a testament to the power of choice and change. 1 week after the battle, as Gabriel tended his garden in the cool morning air, Maria brought him news that Ramon de la Cruz had asked to speak with him. The youngest brother had been the most affected by his defeat, spending sleepless nights wrestling with questions of faith and violence. "He reminds me of you," Francisco observed, watching Gabriel prepare to ride into town. "When Father Miguel first found you," Gabriel paused, touching the new cross at his neck. "We're all lost until we find our true path, mi hermano. Even the most feared gunman can become a shepherd of souls." The town had changed too. Where once people had whispered about the quiet priest's mysterious past, they now spoke openly of their pride in him. The mission was no longer just a church. It had become a symbol of hope in a violent land. Dr. Morrison, treating the last of the wounded attackers, found himself engaged in deep discussions about faith and redemption. "These men came to destroy," he told Gabriel, "but something in your mercy reached them where violence never could. Even old Santiago at the cantina, who had first recognized swift-hand Martinez, saw things differently now. Perhaps," he mused to his customers, "the legend was wrong. Perhaps the deadliest gunman in the territories didn't die or disappear. Perhaps he became something greater." Sheriff Wade, visiting the mission to update Gabriel on his former opponent's legal status, found the priest teaching children there. Letters in the garden. The scene struck him powerfully. This man who could outdraw any killer in the territory, patiently helping a small girl sound out words from the Bible. "The territorial judge is willing to show leniency," Wade said when the lesson finished. "Says he's never seen men like the De La Cruz brothers show such genuine remorse." Gabriel nodded, watching the children head home. "The territory is changing. Sheriff, perhaps it's time for mercy to be stronger than vengeance." As autumn painted the New Mexico desert in shades of gold and crimson, word reached St. Michael's mission that Ramon de la Cruz had taken his own path to redemption. The youngest of the notorious brothers had begun studying for the priesthood. In a monastery near Santa Fe, the cross Gabriel had given him still hanging from his neck. Francisco Vargas, preparing to ride back to his own home, found Gabriel in the chapel one evening. The setting sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the adobe floor. "You've changed this place, hermano," Francisco said softly. "Changed these people, even changed those who came to destroy you." Gabriel smiled, adjusting the candles on the altar. "God changed them, mi amigo. I was merely his instrument, and the legend of swift-hand Martinez, let it fade into dust," Gabriel replied. "The territory needs fewer legends and more shepherds, but legends, like desert winds, have a way of persisting." In the years that followed, stories would be told in cantinas and around campfires about the priest of St. Michael's mission. Some spoke of his lightning-fast draw, others of his deadly accuracy, but increasingly the tales focused on something else: the mercy he showed, the choices he offered, the lives he changed. Dr. Morrison, who would eventually write a memoir of his time at the mission, perhaps captured it best. In a land where violence was a language everyone spoke, Father Gabriel taught us a new dialect, one of courage tempered by compassion, strength guided by faith. The Keller brothers, serving their time in the territorial prison, underwent their own transformation. Jake Keller, once so full of arrogance and cruelty, began writing letters to the priest who had spared his life. "I finally understand," he wrote. "The most powerful thing that day wasn't your speed with a gun, it was your strength to show mercy." One crisp morning, as Gabriel tended his garden under the watchful eyes of the desert mountains, Maria brought him news that made him pause. A young gunslinger was asking about him in Las Cruces, boasting he would challenge the legend of St. Michael's mission. But when the young man finally arrived, he found no fearsome gunfighter awaiting him. Instead, he found a quiet priest teaching children, healing the sick, and offering peace to a violent land. The challenge died unspoken on his lips as he watched Gabriel bless a newborn child with the same hands that had once been the fastest. In the territory, the past never truly leaves us, Gabriel told his congregation one Sunday, the morning sun illuminating the cross that now hung where Ramon's bullet had struck. But it need not define us. Each day, we choose who we become. Sheriff Wade, attending that service, understood finally what had happened at St. Michael's Mission. The legend of Swift-Hand Martinez hadn't ended. It had transformed like lead into gold, into something far more precious and powerful. As dusk settled over the mission that evening, Gabriel stood in his garden one last time, watching the sun paint the desert in familiar shades of red and gold. His Colts remained hidden away, still clean and ready, but no longer defining his days. He had found a different kind of strength, a different way to protect and serve. The bell tolled for evening. Prayers, its deep voice rolling across the desert like distant thunder, but now it called not just the faithful, but also the lost, the violent, the seeking. All were welcome at St. Michael's Mission, where a once deadly gunman had learned to heal rather than harm, and where mercy proved stronger than any bullet. Chaka, legend of Swift-Hand Martinez, had indeed faded into history, but the legacy of Father Gabriel, the priest who taught the territory that redemption could be found even at the point of a gun, would endure long after the desert winds had swept away the last traces of gunsmoke and glory.